evening, everyone. Good evening. Hello. Welcome to tonight's Newcastle Institute lecture on the future of higher education in Australia. My name's Chloe Lindstrom. I'm 21 years old and I'm in my final year of a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in politics and socio-legal studies at the University of Sydney. So this topic isn't just timely, it's deeply personal. I like to start by beginning the acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Awabakal and Worimi people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As we discuss knowledge and learning, we must recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the world's oldest continuing culture, with rich traditions of teaching that has thrived here for over 65,000 years. Thanks for being here tonight, especially with the State of Origin. I'll make sure that we get out of here strictly on time. It's great that we've got students, teachers, policymakers, or simply people who are just interested in education. To begin, I want to paint a picture of what university is like today. I'm a student myself, and I want to talk about my experience. I grew up here in Newcastle, in a family where education really mattered. My mum and grandparents studied at the University of Newcastle, and my late grandfather, the first in his family to attend uni, completed 3 degrees. I think it was mathematics, teaching and economics, and always reminded us how education shapes opportunity. I started my own degree here in 2022, but after major cuts to the arts faculty, I transferred to the University of Sydney. For the last 2 years, I've lived down in Sydney in a small student accommodation, paying more rent than I would care to admit, and working part-time to help fund my studies. This year I moved back home to Newcastle and I now commute down to Sydney by train to study. Like many students, I juggle work, study, commuting and life. I watch my lectures recorded online, not because I want to, but because I have to. The disconnection I have from my peers, tutors and the campus life does really have an impact. As the University Accords noted last year, which for those that don't know what that is, that's a year-long review into the future of higher education in Australia. The Accords found that a sense of belonging drives student well-being, participation, and whether we actually finish our degrees. So we should be really proud that more women, more regional students, and more people from disadvantaged backgrounds are getting the chance to go to university. That's definitely something to celebrate. But with that progress, there's also been a quiet shift. University used to feel like something rare, something families made big sacrifices for, because it promised real opportunity and personal growth. These days, for many of us, it can feel like just another step, a tick of a box to get a job. That sense of university as a place to imagine, explore, and grow feels like it's maybe fading away. On campus, universities now can feel more like businesses than communities of learning. In 2023, I witnessed the longest staff strike in the University of Sydney's history as casual academics, the people teaching me in class, fought for fair pay and secure jobs. I've had tutors openly admit they paid only enough to spend no more than about 5 minutes on my assignment marking it, despite hours of work. That has real consequences on students like me. And this isn't isolated. Just last week, the University of Technology Sydney staff reported soaring stress levels as 400 job cuts loom. Across the country, universities are relying on unstable funding models, rising HECS debt, and international student fees to stay afloat. But education shouldn't be a burden or a business in my view. It should be a public good, just like we saw back in the Whitlam era. As the University Accord says, there's now a growing gap between the promise of higher education and the reality for staff and students on campus. And that's the conversation I hope to have tonight. We're incredibly privileged to be joined by 2 brilliant academics who are leading this conversation. Professor Stefanie Schurer is an economist from the University of Sydney. Her work explores the broader benefits of education and highlights the critical role strong universities play in driving economic growth and productivity in Australia. We also have Dr. Sally Patfield, who's a lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Newcastle. Her research focuses on educational equity, access, and how the public role of universities is evolving over time. We'll start with their reflections and then we'll open up to questions as we usually do. So I'd like to start by welcoming Professor Stefanie Schurer to the stage.
Thank you, Chloe, for the wonderful introduction, and thanks everyone for receiving me so warmly. I'm here because Angela Jackson could not come, I could tell you right away, because both she and I were part of the Australian Conference of Economists, which celebrated its 100-year anniversary in Sydney. And as I was only booked in for one day for plenary and for dinner and some award nights presentations, I could say yes. And Angela, who was also booked in for tomorrow at the conference, had to say no. So you have to deal with me today, who in fact is not a higher education specialist, other than being a professor and having gone through the university tenure ladder myself, and have been educated and lectured in several different places, including Germany, the UK, New Zealand, and the United States and Australia. And my area of expertise, I would say, is human development economics. And because I have done quite a bit of research on human development and how universities, among other educational institutions in primary, tertiary education sector, I said yes, that I could speak about this topic from a fairly informed perspective. And I would like to ask you to be kind to me today, because I've just come back from a conference in Toronto where I presented. I've been yesterday all day at the ACE, and I'm going on Friday to Kuala Lumpur and then to Bali for conferences. So this I had to squeeze in. And the reputation for me as a mother is on my line, because my son sits in the audience, so I'd like to be you to be generous with your criticism. So I've changed the topic a little bit, because I'm not anymore a macroeconomist, so I will not tell you the growth potential of universities, other than giving you a couple of numbers today. So my big question where I'm coming from is, why do we need universities at all in today's environment? And what are the private, the public, and the super societal benefits? You can put this in quotation marks, because the term super societal benefits of universities is mine. I've not read it anywhere else. But before we get started, I would like to ask you in the audience, or those also who joined us here online, who I can't see, but welcome as well. Who knows what this is? What am I showing you here on this photo? Do you know this place and its importance? And how long ago? Where could this be? No?
Bologna.
It's a backwater in Germany. So I'll leave this to you for a moment. This place, a backwater somewhere in Germany, has led a whole societal revolution. And only because someone cared about higher education. And someone put into that tiny backwater a university. And that triggered a whole cultural revolution. And I will come back to this. So I leave this here for the moment. It's important, and when we talk about super societal benefits. So primary and university reform and funding in Australia. I reckon there are many more specialists here in the room who know about the reforms, but I just would like to remind you what we're talking about. And that's important for where we can go in the future. So Chloe has talked about the Whitlam reforms, and they were all about equity and expanding higher education to build the skill level that Australia needs to expand and to achieve prosperity, but also to make universities more equitable. And it was all about the equity, and therefore during the Whitlam era, any fees were taken away so that people who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds can go to university. In the early 1980s, student fees have been reintroduced under the Hawke and Keating government, and also the HECS, the higher education credit system, has been introduced, which from my perspective as a German is one of the greatest innovations in higher education funding. And I assume all in the room here, you're fairly familiar with the system, but it allows people to go to university without the upfront cost of tuition fees, and then only pay back later once you reach a particular income threshold that allows you to repay part of your debt. And I will, at the end of this conversation, I will talk about that again. And then in the late 1980s, the then education minister Dawkins and the Dawkins reforms tried to streamline the education sector by merging some of these polytechnic universities with general universities, simply to streamline the sector and make it more efficient. And then in the 1990s, John Howard came in with a sweeping reform trying to make these universities much more efficient. And that led to a deregulation process that then led to a hike in tuition fees. So tuition fees is really the payment that the student would consume university or invest in their education. I purposefully use these two expressions. Then have higher cost and therefore higher debt. And so that came along with funding cuts from the public sector into tertiary education funding. And then, so around 2008, that's when I hit the market here in Australia as a freshly minted PhD and started at University of Melbourne, but that also coincided with the global financial crisis. And I'm grateful that University of Melbourne did give me a job, whereas so many others did not, missed out on this labor market. In 2008, there was the Bradley Review and the Lomax-Smith Review, and a year later, and that all led about how can we improve the quality of these universities, and how can we make these universities ever more competitive. That did start already in the Howard era, to make these universities more competitive in an international comparison, because the education market is a highly global market, as you know well, and that has led for Australia also to some problems. And so I had with Rob, and he invited me a little bit of a conversation that when did this really start? The enterprise university or the corporatization of the university sector. I would say this really started around, I mean, it did start much earlier, but around the Howard government and when deregulation came in, and then around the mid-2000s, when this led to really the enterprise university, corporatization, streamlining processes in universities, increasing student evaluation rankings, and competing in an international market. And that led also to some managerialism, and meaning that also for me as a staff member it becomes ever more complicated because it's all about measurement and performance and the student experience. To attract high fee-paying students from all over the world to come to Australia. And I must say that this attempt was highly successful in boosting the presence of Australian universities in the many international rankings that exist. I'm showing you here the QS ranking that is very important for the Asian student market. And in this QS ranking, you see here in the top 100 of most successful or elite or whatever you want to call it, universities, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, at least 9 universities, not all of them, group of 8, in this ranking. I could have shown you also Times Higher Education ranking. You also have 7 or 8 in this top 100. And you see, when you go a little bit further to the 200s and 300s, you would see many more also regional universities, like University of Wollongong showing up in these rankings. And from a German who comes from an education system originally trained in Germany, where you have no student fees and where you have high quality institutions from a historical perspective, and we'll talk more about this, but who show nowhere up in these rankings. That's a success story. So many students in the world will want to come to Australia to study, not only because the beaches are so wonderful and the sailing opportunities are seemingly infinite. And yeah, so Australia is also really important, this university sector, from a macroeconomic perspective, because it is the fourth strongest export sector. In what I'm showing you here in this graph is Australia's top 5 export goods and services in Australian $1 million, and what you see on the horizontal axis is the different industries. Of course, coal and iron ore are the strongest ones, the highest turnover ones. Natural gas and gold, all of these are highly reliant on the global price for mineral resources, and these are finite resources. At some point they might be gone. But then sits there the education sector, and that is a $50 billion export industry, employing at the moment somewhere around 130,000 full-time equivalent staff, and bringing, and I hope I get this number right, over 500,000 students into the country or who study here. This is a huge industry. And there you see why corporatization and the enterprise university model is so successful, or has been so successful. So that's the graph here. And you see here, I mean, you see different years here, before COVID and then after COVID, latest data available 2023 and 2024, which is the 50 billion. It did dip down to 30 billion during the COVID years, or maybe even smaller, 20 billion. So you see the sector is highly sensitive to border restrictions and visa restrictions. So we can go immediately within a year to another, we can lose $30 billion on this. And this is why it's a sensitive topic. You can see here also is budget expenditure, so how much does the Australian government spend in its budget on education-related expenses. This is for data from 2022 to 2023, so slightly outdated by 2 years. Higher education makes up something at 1.7% of that budget. But when you dig deeper into what is really spent or contributed from the government, at a lower level and compare at a more detailed level of what really goes to universities and how does Australia fare with respect in an international context, it looks very different. So, and I want to highlight that. So what you see here is a graph. This is now data from 2021 from the most recent report from the OECD. The OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, sits in Paris, it's a knowledge multilateral corporate organization, and it puts together statistics in particular related to the knowledge industry. And you see lots of countries here. And the EU average is this pink bar that you see, and the orange bar is, maybe I can point to this, maybe that's possible. Here. And so this pointer does not point where I want to point. So we do it in the old style again. We take the mouse. You see the mouse? Yeah. Okay, here. OECD average, EU average. On the vertical axis is the expenditure on educational institutions as a percentage of GDP. This is for everything. Early childhood. Helen works on early childhood investment, so that's in there as well. It's primary education, secondary education, tertiary education. And what you see here is Norway is on top. And why is Norway on top? Does anyone know? Spends, what, 8% on education? Why? Yes. And why? because they invested in a sovereign wealth fund, and now today they moved the market. We could have done it in 2003 and 2004. The Howard government decided for tax cuts instead, and so now we do not have a sovereign wealth fund with which we could have moved the financial markets. So this is why Norway has this. But Australia sits pretty, did I put something up here? Pretty high as well, spends 6.6% of GDP on education. And you can see here, this teal bar, or maybe darker teal bar here is tertiary education. So not that small. Okay, this is expenditures, not the government. It's total expenditures, what the country spends overall. And the important bit is who pays for it. In Norway, it's pretty much the government. Public spending is quite low in the Australian context. So here, this is again the OECD, the blue light bar in the middle here is the OECD average. Norway is up on top. You see over 90% of expenditures on tertiary education is paid for by the government, Luxembourg, Iceland, Germany as well. So I come from one of these countries. Yeah. And then you see Australia, United Kingdom, somewhere on the bottom. So here it's less than 40%. The numbers have decreased again. There has been a trend to further decrease this. And then what you say, public investment in higher education is also low as a percentage of GDP. As you can see here, data from 2018, I could not figure out this number for 2023. I thought it was something below 0.2% of GDP, but I couldn't replicate that number. So before COVID, it was 0.65%, but I know it is definitely under 0.4. I just couldn't corroborate that. And who's paying? Well, it's private investments. And that's what Chloe talked about, this high student debt. But it's not just domestic students, it's international students who are coming here, and they pay 1.23%, this is this number here, of GDP into their degree. So you could think it's a private investment. The same is for the United States, it's 1.6%, and the UK, so they're roughly the same. And then in countries where you have the Scandinavian countries, in Sweden, this is where my son's father comes from, they spend very little private investment. And so this is important when you consider higher education reform discussions. You might not squeeze out more on the student side. We are already at the very high level. So what's the purpose of university education at all? Is it still, like, should we invest all of this money privately or publicly? And so can these universities also cater for the needs? So where do universities come from? They do come from a medieval Christian tradition. Our modern universities come out of the monasteries and attempts to study the scriptures. And they emerged from the monasteries in the Latin church. They were instruction was in Latin, made possible by a papal bull. So University of Oxford is one of them, University of Paris, University of Bologna, all founded 1200. Can someone help me? Is this something like 800 and something years ago? So they have very long traditions, but they were heavily influenced, mandated by the Catholic Church. Then the modern universities emerged in the 19th century. Modern research universities were established in particular in Germany. And these universities, they had a science focus, whereas the old universities had a humanities focus in studying in Latin, studying the scriptures. The modern universities would do science, and that's where all these scientific innovations happened in chemistry and physics and in medicine. And Germany was at the time, in the 19th century, the focal point in the world to study. So people would travel from all over the world to study in Germany. This ended in 1933, when the National Socialists targeted the universities within 2 months of getting into power and turning them into Nazi universities. The universities complied and collaborated and threw out all of its Jewish scientists. And that was the end of the world-leading nature of German universities. And where did they all go? If they managed to get out, they went to the United States. So the model, the German model of universities was adopted elsewhere in the world. Johns Hopkins University in Washington was the first to adopt the German model around 1850. But the human capital, the skills, the brilliant scientists came through the 1930s and afterwards. Albert Einstein is one of these cases. When he was under attack already before the Nazis came into power because of anti-Semitism, but as soon as the Nazis were in power, he turned around, went straight back to the US and stayed in Princeton for the rest of his life. So, and then in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, these new public management style universities came into effect, managerialism and corporatization of the sector with high fee-paying structures. So what's the purpose of a university? I dug around a little bit. And the Robbins report, which was a report for the Committee on Higher Education in the UK, which was run by led by Lionel Robbins, was published in 1963. There were 4 reasons for universities listed. One is skill development. So I'm in that business. I'm in skill development. I teach statistics for economists, causal evaluation techniques, policy evaluation techniques, writing skills, oral skills, good behavior in public spaces. I'll do all of that. And so we should do all of this. But skills goes in here. But if that's the only reason why you go to university, that might not be sufficient. You can learn this online, like in today's world. You can learn this on YouTube. So my son's generation just opens a YouTube video if they want to learn something new. And why would you go to university? There were other reasons why you go to university. One is the promotion of general powers of the mind. So I put a little brain here. To create cultivated men and women and men who appreciate the arts, who do know about history, who can converse in different languages. That could be one of the purposes. And these liberal arts colleges in the US do exactly this. Then there is, of course, the search for truth. And that is a quite important one today in a world where we are bombarded with fake news and information we don't really know anymore. It's about truth-telling, and universities can do this. And why can universities do this? Because they give you the space. If you don't have a mandated research agenda at a university, but you're a general university and you allow free research, then you can generate truth, regardless of how long it takes and how inefficient that process might be. And I will come back to this. And then, of course, you can use universities also as a tool to transmit a common culture or community. You can use it in a form of creating a pathway of ideology that you would like to transmit to in socialistic communist societies, this was the case. You just bombard them with a particular style or a particular curriculum about values. We economists do that too. We are being accused of also teaching a free market economy ideology, and that is true. We rarely think outside the box, and I take that as a criticism. But in any case. So are universities under threat with what I've just described today? One great challenge with these universities today is this risk of AI, and I do fear that my job might be gone by 2027 or 2028. And I'm also worried about that the grades I give to the students are no longer the grades they really deserve on their knowledge, because with ChatGPT and other AI algorithms, they might produce output that reads much better what I can ever write, but it's not theirs. It's just a tool. And how do we deal with this as a university? It's very tricky. And how do we achieve academic integrity so that it is really worthwhile also paying $50,000 for a degree, or have someone pay for you that amount of money? Then, and maybe Chloe will not like what I'm saying now, is this young generation that comes through, is it even equipped to go through university? Here is some research on Gen Z. And what is their attention span? Is it 76 seconds? So, I mean, whenever my Instagram app is on my phone, I also have an attention span of roughly 35 seconds. So can you sit through a 1.5-hour lecture? Maybe not. So universities are really challenged by this, and I feel this in my lectures. And then there sit the students, and they have their mobile phones or their laptops on. I have no idea what they're doing. And when you ask them, they're like, huh? And I'm really grateful you're actually not doing this right now. And where do young people even get their information from? So here is about some research from researchers about young Australians increasingly get news from social media. TikTok is a platform for political news. And I thought TikTok is just a platform for showing your own little dance videos. But in this study finds that teenagers aged 13 to 16-year-olds, 1 in 3 gets their news from all the information from social media platforms. What can I bring to the table in a 1.5-hour lecture with maybe equations and boring gray and white tables? So this is a real challenge for the future for universities. So benefits, I want to skim through this because I want to leave some space then also for Sally to talk about this. You can think of the benefits of universities or any form of higher education, but let's stick to universities, private, public, and super societal benefits. Please have that in mind. I will come back to that first picture of my slides. And here's a report from Deloitte that was put together about in 2016, in fact, and published in 2017 on private and public benefits and market and non-market benefits. And that distinction between market and non-market benefit is important. Whenever we talk about a market benefit, we talk about a study about what are the returns to education in terms of wages, productivity, hourly wages, or your paycheck. And that literature is massive, mature, insightful. We pretty much, I think since the 1970s, economists have nailed that. We know what that number is, and I will give you an example. But then there are public benefits, spillover effects, that can be market benefits, that is here on the right. For instance, labor productivity spillovers, better educated workers, faster workers. They're going to create peer effects to people in the workplace, and they might be faster, might be more sociable, might be better team players. That can have spillover effects that make companies like Google or other companies much faster and create a turnover. And that also leads to spillover effects for the public coffers in terms of tax income. But then you have these non-market benefits, and I think Sally will talk about that as well. Improved health and well-being, the pure consumption effects of university, just staying a little bit longer for 3 or 4 years and avoiding the grind of the labor market, of an unfair boss who slaves you around. So it just gives you 3-4 years extra as a young person. That may be a consumption benefit, but it could also create greater non-market benefits of just a fairer society, less inequality, etc., etc. And the private benefits, I wanted to bring a study also from Australia, but this literature is huge. There must be thousands of papers of the return to education. And we usually think of 1 extra year of education gives you a wage boost by 6 or 7%. That number in the literature ranges somewhere between 5 and 15%, depending on the identification strategy, depending on the data set, depending on the year you do that. But this is a study based on HILDA, the Household Income and Labor Dynamics Survey, here from researchers at Curtin universities. Pretty spot on, 7% per extra year. Okay. Then this Deloitte report from 2016 tried to make an effort as well to figure out what are the public and private returns. And what you see here on the right-hand side here, please forget the left-hand side for a moment. I don't have time to talk about that. But so they tried to figure out what's the public benefit, because you always have a private benefit and then you have a public benefit. And they find that, all these so the wage benefits you have, the marketable benefits, 45% are just post-tax earnings. It's what you have in your coffers extra. So roughly a half of that is private benefits, and the other half, a little bit more, is public benefits, and that comes through personal income taxation and other market public benefits. Okay, and you can look as well this by discipline. Maybe I can get the larger, it's down here, but pretty much, regardless of whether that's medicine or IT or science or arts, it's pretty much half-half, except for engineering, has much greater public benefits. And yeah, I mean, engineers build bridges, etc. Yeah, makes sense. So we have done quite a lot of research in my lab about the life cycle benefits of university education or compulsory school leaving age reforms. Here is one of these papers. And in this paper, we used the compulsory school leaving age reforms in the 1960s. Is anyone in the room who was affected by this policy and was forced to stay in school by an extra year? No, because in New South Wales it happened in the 1940s, and we identify this off in South Australia and Victoria and compare this to ACT in New South Wales. And importantly, by forcing men and women to stay a year longer, that's the cause of the natural experiment, but forcing them to stay a year longer has spillover effects. And for women during this time, this led to higher post-secondary education. And that led to greater wealth over the life cycle. So we look at the end of the life cycle when they're roughly 60 years old. And for women, this leads to better mates, better marriage, and greater house wealth, like property wealth, and a greater probability of ending up in professional occupations. And these are benefits, life cycle benefits, you see they add up. So a little thing changes, you're being forced to stay a year longer. So you might be more likely to go to university. And that leads then to life cycle benefits. It also, for men, leads to better happiness and family stability. And then we had also conducted analysis on non-cognitive skills. These are the sociability skills, something like your altruistic behavior, prosociality, or your agreeableness. Are you cooperative in games? So we looked at that for a cohort of young people in the Household Income and Labor Dynamics survey. And we wanted to know, as they go through university, we had data on these same non-cognitive skills before they enter university, and then look at it after they leave university, and compare that to comparable young people who for some reason did not go to university. And what you find is that all of them, regardless of their socioeconomic background, they stay more sociable, to have greater levels of extraversion. And what we see is people who don't go to university, their sociability drops fairly quickly in their 20s. And for young people who stay at university, that stays. There are market benefits to sociability. That's established in the literature. But importantly, what we also find is for students who come from highly disadvantaged backgrounds, their agreeableness levels get boosted as they go through university. And that means they become more cooperative and more pro-social as a consequence of university education. You find this also in the US context. This is a review I've written in 2016 and published in 2017. And there's only one thing I wanted to point out. Here's a very famous study by James Heckman, a Nobel Prize winner from Chicago, and others. And they compared people who go to college versus non-college. They also claim that this is causal. I doubt it, but let it be for the moment. He's a Nobel Prize winner, so he can make that statement without being guillotined and incarcerated. So they looked at here these different non-cognitive skills here. They're listed here. And when you compare people who go to college and people who don't, all of their non-cognitive skills get boosted. So there is this non-market return of these skills because not all of them have a labor market boost. So universities are perfectly equipped to train these softer skills because it's like a laboratory, because they are in like a little box and they can't go away if they come to the lectures. I have heard you, Chloe, you talked about online experiences, and that's very insulating, I do agree. University benefits come from interactions with each other, not from simply cramming information in your brain. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, but I want to talk about super society benefits. So where is this?
Heidelberg?
No, it's Wittenberg. It's Wittenberg, and who was in Wittenberg? Luther. Here he is. And there's something you might not know, or you may be all laughing because you're highly educated and cultured individuals in the room and you say, we know all of this already. So, he apparently hammered these 95 theses, there were actually 97, on the halls of Wittenberg. Or he probably did not do that. But does anyone know, how did he find the time and the resources to actually sit down and work them out, these 95 theses, challenging the indulgences of the Catholic Church? So he was challenging the practices and the interpretations of the script. That's a gargantuan effort. How could he do it? How could he find the time? Wasn't he in a monastery and would be praying all day or reading? At the time in the monasteries, reading was done together. And there were these elaborate, ornate scriptures. And they would read to each other in Latin and didn't really have a discussion culture. He wasn't in the monastery anymore at that time. There was. I come straight to this because I don't have time. There was a man called Frederick III, the Elector. At the time, there were 7 electors, little princelings in backwaters of Germany who had the right to nominate and elect the next emperor. So they had power and resources. And this one, Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, and this is why it's the backwater, founded a university. And that was University of Wittenberg, around 1500 and something. In that university, he wanted to have a free space where scholars can think. Philip Melanchthon was there as well. And Luther got his PhD from Erfurt. Didn't get it from there, but he became a professor at a very young age. And he said, I can freely do research because that Frederick the Elector didn't impose any mandates, no ideology, free space, free time. So what Luther did, and I have that from The Rest is History from Tom Holland. I did not know that until very recently. He took the scripture, the Bible, and he scrapped everything. He said, because of Gutenberg, he could print his own little version. And he took all the ornaments away and said, I just want to have the text. Just want to see what's written. And then he translated it into German. And then he realized, and I take Aristotle out as well, because for some reason in around 1200, all these scriptures of Aristotle were found. And the scholars took it into their scripts. So he took all of this redundant stuff out and went back to the original texts and realized none of these things like indulgences were ever in there. Indulgences is you buy yourself out of purgatory, right? And the more you pay, the more money the less time you have in purgatory. He questioned all this, and because he had free time in this university, he could write a new text and send it, and either put it on the city halls, on the wall, on the doors, which he probably did not do, but then also distributed. And that led to what? The Reformation, the greatest societal revolution, which the reason why we are all educated today comes from this period, because Luther and many others from the Protestant Reformation movement really cared about educating the people and making them read and write, and having the sermons in the churches in German and not in Latin. And so that meant you suddenly had a redemocratization of faith and of knowledge. Okay. So a wrap up. Australian universities are highly successful in a global competitive market. They're mainly funded through private contributions. This is possible because of deregulation and great international interest. paired with the high rankings, there is great demand for these universities. But the new funding model is now under threat because of strategic, defense strategic reasons where we want to cut international student numbers, also for housing markets and so on. But this model is under threat. And once the international students are gone, our funding model is gone. And AI in social media is a threat because it threatens the academic integrity. But there are great private and public benefits of universities. So I believe we should not give up on this university model as such. Challenges ahead. And where will we go next? Well, we could discuss this today. I will leave this open for you, and I would like to hand over to Sally now, who will talk about the challenges for young people to go to university and their perceptions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefanie, and thank you for the invitation to present tonight. So Chloe did a really lovely acknowledgement of country earlier this evening, but I also wanted to acknowledge the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal Nation as the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on tonight. So I am a lecturer here at the University of Newcastle, and I started off my career as a primary school teacher, and since doing my PhD, all of my research is in the realm of education, specifically looking at the views of young people, of teachers, and of young people's families as well. And what I wanted to speak a little bit about tonight in relation to tonight's topic is the value of university for young people today, and particularly in the current climate. And I've just put up on the screen here two newspaper articles or online articles that have appeared in the media over the past couple of weeks. And I want to use these as a bit of a jumping off point or a provocation for thinking about how young people, how their families are viewing higher education in today's climate. So you can see there the top one, that's a piece from the Financial Review, and it's titled, Have Young Australians Lost Faith in the Value of University? And that was from a few weeks ago. And then the bottom piece there just came out actually earlier this week from Jenna Price in the Sydney Morning Herald. And that's actually a bit of a cause of concern in terms of her views, in terms of pretty much asking people or kind of recommending young people and their families to really reconsider university in the current climate. So I've titled my presentation tonight, Have Young People Lost Faith in the Value of University? And so what I'm going to be doing is drawing on a decade of research that we've been conducting here at the University of Newcastle, looking at young people's aspirations and how they've actually changed over time, which provides insight into how we're thinking differently or society's thinking differently about university and post-school transitions today. So when you were younger, probably somebody asked you this question: when I grow up, I want to be, or what do you want to be when you grow up? So we take this question as a starting point for thinking about the sociological conditions of society. So how are young people imagining their future? How are they thinking about their post-school transitions in terms of their education, in terms of their occupational futures as well? So back in 2012, we commenced a program of research looking at young people's aspirations. And we're going to be drawing a lot on this research today to shed light into young people's views about higher education. So in 2012, we commenced what's called the Aspirations Longitudinal Study, and that was the jumping off point for a number of other studies that we've conducted since, looking at aspirations, looking at the idea of equity, looking at how inequities play out in how young people think about their future and their transitions into post-school education. So just because of time, I won't go into all of those studies, but I'm primarily going to be drawing on the initial one that we conducted in 2012 and a follow-up study in 2017, which was also conducted looking at young people's educational and occupational aspirations. And then more recently, what we've done is it's one thing to look at how young people think about their future, but it's another thing to actually look at or think about how do their aspirations align with what they actually end up doing. So in 2021, we were actually able then to follow up with these young people, their families and their teachers to actually think about or look at what these young people ended up doing post-school. And then more recently, last year and this year, what we've done is returned to some of the same schools we conducted our initial research at back in 2012 to actually look at how young people's thoughts about the future have changed. So since we began our initial research, we've obviously had COVID, there's more concern now about things like climate change, there's a lot more political instability. So how have some of those things impacted the way young people are thinking about their future? So just to give you a sense of our data, this is actually combined, or this program of research that we've been conducting here at the University of Newcastle is one of the largest studies in the world into young people's aspirations. And actually in Australia, apart from the longitudinal studies of Australian youth, it's actually the largest study into young people's aspirations in Australia. So a very large data set in terms of the data we're drawing on tonight. So in terms of the surveys, so this is the initial survey data from 2012 to 2015, and then the follow-up in 2017. So you can see there just in terms of the extent of the data in terms of the surveys we conducted with students, parents, carers, teachers, and we also wanted to look in depth through conducting interviews as well. So in terms of the sample, so you can see there in terms of all of the schools being based here in New South Wales, and we wanted to also ensure a mix of metropolitan schools and those in more regional and remote areas as well. So in the survey we conducted with young people, so in terms of the initial survey we conducted, the students were enrolled from years 3 up until year 12, so really quite a longitudinal sample there in terms of their age, and we followed them over time for a number of years as well. So in the survey, they were asked this question: what is the highest level of education you plan to complete? And in the survey, that was a closed-ended question with 4 options. So the options that were available in the survey were high school, TAFE, university, or I don't know. So you can see there among the sample, and remember it's quite a large survey sample, university was the most popular educational aspiration among young people. And that trend held regardless of how we looked at the data. So it was always the most popular aspiration among people from different backgrounds in terms of their location, in terms of gender, in terms of SES. What was also interesting in terms of how we looked at the data, there were always around a quarter of young people who were unsure of their aspirations, and they're represented here by the category there, I don't know. And then in the survey as well, they were asked this question as an indicator of their occupational aspirations. So the question was, what kind of work would you like to be doing when you grow up? So for this question, that was actually an open-ended question. So young people could write whatever they actually thought of in terms of what they imagined for their future. So what we did here was we categorised occupational aspirations based on the skill level required or needed for that job. So generally, skill level 1 are occupations that require a university qualification. Skill level 2 to 4 jobs are those that require a TAFE degree or a diploma. And skill level 5 jobs are those generally that require on-the-job training or work-based training. So you can see here, not only is there a strong interest in university among young people, there's also a strong interest in occupations requiring a university degree. Given the nature of today's talk in terms of the future of higher education, what I want to focus on now, using that data as a bit of a background or a bit of a context for how young people are thinking about their future, what I want to do now is think about or look at how do these aspirations actually look at, how do these aspirations relate to the post-school choices that young people end up taking. So this diagram here is what's called a Sankey diagram. And if you follow the lines along, it actually looks at the flow in terms of the pathways that young people are taking in their life. So right on the left-hand side, that's their educational aspirations while they were at school. So you can see there the ones who listed high school, the ones who listed TAFE, the ones who listed university, and the ones who were unsure. And then when we followed up with them in 2021, some of them were 1 year post-school, some were up to 7 years post-school. So you can see there where their destination was when we spoke to them or met up with them again in 2021. And then finally, when we did interview them and surveyed them again in 2021, we were also interested to look at or find out about their future plans for their education as well. So you can see there, in terms of, just going to focus tonight on the ones who were interested in university, that sometimes, or quite often, what young people are thinking about for their future in terms of their aspirations, particularly around university, often doesn't translate them into them taking that pathway. So you can see here, for instance, where you've got quite a large number of students who were initially interested or expressed interest in university actually went to TAFE. Quite a number of students as well were interested in university and didn't pursue any further study. And then you can see quite a number of students again were interested in university and pursued university. And the students who quite often took that more kind of linear pathway, they were interested in university or they aspired to university, they went to university, were those from more advantaged backgrounds. So those ones who took the more linear pathway, more advantaged backgrounds, white, middle class families. When we followed up with these students in 2021, there were some interesting insights in terms of their reflections on their journeys that gives us a bit of cause for concern about the way that university is now positioned in society, or the way it has been positioned. So these are the 3 key insights that we took away from the interviews. We heard that young people believe that university has been pushed onto them as an overarching expectation. We also heard that while a university might originally be perceived as a pathway to the good life, this narrative is increasingly being questioned by young people. And finally, that the pressure to succeed can cause or even worsen mental ill health. And I'm going to illustrate those points through a few quotes now and elaborate on them. So in terms of this idea of university being an overarching expectation, Chloe and Stefanie alluded to or spoke briefly about the Universities Accord. Stefanie also mentioned the Bradley Review. So there's been now for a few decades this push to increase representation in higher education, particularly around the agenda of widening participation, trying to increase the number of students attending university from disadvantaged backgrounds. So in essence, that policy has had some effect in terms of young people feeling this generational push to go to university, regardless potentially of their own interests. I should note here that all of the names given are pseudonyms as well. So Lucky here is one young person we spoke to in 2021. And she says here, I felt pressured as a group or as a generation to go to university. So really this mindset that you have to go to university. And this pressure held regardless of what young people were interested in terms of their occupational pathways or what they were interested in pursuing in terms of anything in life. So Angus here spoke a lot about how when he was at school, he actually really wanted to be a chef. But he was told, because you're smart, you should actually go to university. So there's this kind of link here between being smart, needing to go to university, and university also being equated with success. We also heard, though, that young people were increasingly questioning the link between higher education and success as they got older. So Audrey here, so this is one of her initial quotes that we heard from her back when we interviewed her initially in 2014. And she says here, personally, I've just always pictured uni as being more successful. If you do uni, then you'll be more successful afterwards compared to if you just did TAFE. And Audrey told us that she was interested in working with animals. When we then followed up with her in 2021, so this was now quite a number of years post-school, she actually didn't end up going to university, ended up pursuing a vocational pathway. And then it wasn't until post-school that she actually realised that there are other avenues you can take to fulfil your career aspirations. And here she speaks about this sense of that there's this pressure given to go to university to succeed, and again, this linking between university and success. And here in 2021, she reflects on the fact that if you don't go to uni, it's not the end of the world, in a complete opposition to the way she positioned university when she was at school. One of the other key themes from our interviews, as I mentioned, is this idea around mental ill health. And I think in society now, there's a lot more awareness of mental ill health among young people, a lot more discourse of mental health being out in the open. But in terms of this pressure given, in terms of succeeding, the pressure given to go to university, it caused or sparked or worsened the mental ill health that young people were experiencing. Dahlia here is a young Indigenous woman. When we met her, first of all, in 2015, she aspired to go to university. She really wanted to make generational change by working in psychology, and particularly around psychology for Indigenous Australians. However, when we heard from her, or when we met her again in 2021, she actually had dropped out of high school and had talked a lot about experiencing racism, particularly during her HSC. One of the other key things, though, she said, was this sense of being burnt out by the pressure to succeed, by the pressure to do well. And so we heard from a lot of young people that when they had gotten to university or when they had finished school and pursued their post-school pathway, that there was this sense of being burnt out or being overwhelmed. And finally, what I also want to look at tonight is, so we've conducted this research now for more than a decade. And in particular, it shows how young people's thoughts about the future have changed over the last 10 or so years. So drawing on our most recent data, so as I mentioned back in last year and this year, we returned to the same schools that we've been working with for quite a number of years. And what we've done is re-interviewed a new group of students and looked at how their thoughts about the future are starting to change. And these are some of the key themes that came up in our most recent interviews. We've heard that concerns about the value of a university qualification are growing. Young people are now more worried about the financial risk of university, or risk in general. They see university as now a risky pathway. Vocational education and work-based pathways are increasingly being seen as more secure than university. And quite starkly, young people are increasingly expressing things like fear, stress, and doubt about their future. And that's linked to current issues and trends in society, such as costs of living, this sense of uncertainty in society, more political instability, and also the changing nature of the job market. So again, I'm just going to highlight through some of the quotes from students, and this time also bring in some of the data from parents. So we saw from the interviews this real sense of a perception of the devaluation of a university degree. So in the past, when we first spoke to young people back in 2012 to 2015, there was a lot more excitement around university, seeing this as a pathway that they wanted to go down. And as both Stefanie and Chloe were talking about, a place where it's not only for learning, but actually in terms of building your life around the societal benefits of higher education. However, last year and this year, when we returned to the schools, these are some of the things that we heard. So Tani here is a year 11 student, and we spoke to her earlier this year. And then she's really concerned here in terms of her thoughts about the value of a higher education degree. And she says, in the workplace, a university degree doesn't really matter, or that's what she's being told. If you've got the skills, then we'll still take you anyway. So this sense that now, actually a university degree doesn't matter as much as what it used to. So not only was there a sense of the devaluation of a university degree overall, but also around particular degrees. So Katie here, she speaks about the devaluation of business degrees. So here she's tossing up between architecture and business, but she says a lot of people have told me that a business degree is useless. Like they said, if you do a business degree, it's not going to make you rich. It's not going to help you start your own business. It's just going to be a waste of time and money. One of the key things we also heard, as I mentioned, is this idea of risk, and particularly around financial risk. So in terms of the HECS debt that comes with a higher education degree, young people are increasingly worried about the debt that they will have probably for the rest of their lives in some cases. So Josie here, she was a year 12 student, or is a year 12 student. We spoke to her earlier this year. And she says, I get very, very overwhelmed by the idea of how much money you have to pay for university. And she speaks here about some of the co-workers who were talking with her sister, and they have hundreds of thousands of dollars of HECS debt. So what we heard here, and you can see it at the end of the quote, is students were really conscious of the cost of living crisis. This sense that you won't be able to afford a house because of the debt that you'll have by going to university. We also heard, or what we also found, was a much more pragmatic approach to thinking about the future. And that came from both young people and from their parents and their families as well. So young people and their families have now started to weigh up a lot more in terms of the risks of their future versus the benefits of their future. And that's also in relation to university, TAFE, and particular occupational pathways as well. So you can see here, one of the parents we interviewed who lives in Sydney, and she says here, just the other day, my daughter said something about teaching doesn't earn enough. you can't afford to live in Sydney as a teacher. But at the same time, she's talking to her daughter about do what you're interested in. So there's this sense there that her daughter's already aware that if she wants to stay living in Sydney, being able to afford a house, being a teacher, unfortunately isn't good enough. One of the things that also came out in our most recent interviews is the financial rewards and security that is now perceived to be offered through vocational education. So one of the parents again here just highlights this point in terms of what's kind of seen as some of the lifestyle benefits of going to TAFE or pursuing vocational pathways versus university-based pathways. So you can see here where she's saying they all earn ridiculous amounts of money and her kids see that lifestyle and see what they are able to afford. And that's really enticing for them. So in a lot of our communities, particularly in the more working class communities, more rural communities, particularly also those with access to mine-based work, they were actually now lured in more by these kinds of pathways. Overall, what we found in the interviews we conducted last year and this year is a lot more stress, doubt and uncertainty about the future. And that's linked to the future of higher education and the way young people are thinking about their futures. So you can just see here in two examples from these young people, Sasha in year 8 and Jazz in year 11, quite young people already worried about their future. So Sasha here talks about everything getting more expensive. So she's clearly experienced that within her family. And she's also concerned about the possibility or opportunity to ever buy a house. And Jazz at the bottom there speaks about, we used to go on a Sunday drive and have a Sunday roast. I think back to just a couple of years ago and I think, how have things changed so drastically? So that's quite sad, in my opinion, in terms of that young people being really conscious of some of the changes in her family and having undergone those and witnessed those in her family. We also heard from the parents. So in terms of the stress and the strain that current society is under, in terms of young people thinking about their future, Lainey here exemplifies the way parents and also teachers in a sense were conscious of the world they were leaving behind for young people. And Lainey here says, I look at what society is today and I wonder, what have I put him into? It's a horror movie, really. So these views of parents were really tied to this sense of stress, doubt and uncertainty among young people. So in terms of linking this back to the theme for tonight and linking this back to some of the policy concerns, so like we mentioned, we've had the Bradley Review of Higher Education that really pushed this idea of equity, and that really also set in stone the push to increase higher education numbers, but also representation among different equity targets. That was recently reinforced last year by the Universities Accord. Since the Bradley Review, there's been a focus on aspirations, and that actually was part of the impetus for us doing this research. And in terms of looking at young people's aspirations in policy, what policy has often done is put the blame on young people, put the blame on families in terms of them lacking the aspiration to go to university, or them not having the right aptitude to pursue higher education, and so on. So in terms of this research, what we want to pose is, rather than young people continually being blamed for their lack of aspiration, how can we now actually think about how higher education might evolve to meet the challenges and demands of our time? So I started on a question or a provocation, and I want to now leave you with thinking about this question as well. So thank you very much.
thank you, Sally and Stefanie. That was really, really interesting, and I've certainly scribbled away with a few notes. We're now going to open to the floor, but I'd like to invite you both up. We've got a roving mic, and in the interest of time, do you mind both coming back up? Thank you. Sorry, I know you've just sat them down. Thank you. I'm going to start with a question just while Rob's getting set up and everyone can have a think. You both raised great points. With Stefanie, yeah, you're right. Stefanie talking about the risks now on academic integrity with social media and AI, as well as Sally talking about what universities now look like for young people. I certainly took away many points, but I want to ask you both, and it kind of maybe brings it all together, what's one thing that you hope will change? That maybe university sectors in Australia hypothetically would sit down and think we need to look at whether it's AI, or we need to look at the way that we encourage students now in high school to look at university as an option. What's one thing you would like to see change?
One thing you change in higher education? One thing. That's an intelligence test. No, I wouldn't change HEX at all. HEX is one of the great Australian achievements worldwide. You can tinker a little bit, and there was, of course, some debt forgiveness. One of my honours students from last year, who works now for Treasury and should pay back, he said, I've just been forgiven $12,000 out of a $60,000 debt. And then and I said to him, you have to pay this back quickly. He says, no, now I wait for the next forgiveness. No. Rational, much smarter than the oldies. No, I wouldn't tinker with HEX at all. At all. But what I personally would change is what we teach at universities. Because in this entertainment industry that young people have access to and YouTube and experiences and their well-being, and students today come in and say, what about work-life balance? And when they do their PhD with me, and I'm thinking, just work harder. And it used to be different, but the today's Gen Z and the ones that will follow is Gen Alpha, is my son maybe Gen Alpha. They're very different. They really value their time differently. And there is a high opportunity cost of time. And we economists teach this, the opportunity cost of time. And there's also something I hadn't mentioned when I quite broadly talked about all these wonderful private and public benefits. There is a psychic cost, and there is a time and opportunity cost that Sally talked about. And these psychic costs of university education, they are non-negligible. They are high, potentially. Not everyone should be at university at all. And I agree with there are so many other opportunities to get qualification and to be skilled. I would personally expand. So I would change a bit the skills, the life skills we teach students. So I've started introducing meditation exercises. It's not compulsory, but before the 8 o'clock lecture starts, I offer 15 minutes earlier a 5 to 10 minute meditation exercise. I steal it from someone else. I can't say now from whom. These exercises, I don't do it. I put up a YouTube video that's freely available. And I teach students to help to self-regulate in stressful moments, to bring down the brain, to learn to focus again, and just to let your mind rest, or at least practice to rest. I would do that, but I would also expand TAFE. It was a huge mistake to take funding away from TAFE. And I would expand it even more and to look at cases like Germany. It doesn't have to be like Germany, but the dual education, this dual system of school and practical training, and to bring back the idea of the guilds. There's beauty in the mastery of the trades, and that should be celebrated. So I would put a lot of investment in there.
Yeah, I might raise 2 points. I think in terms of the Universities Accord that we mentioned before, one of the things they did get right is in terms of how actually tertiary education can work better overall. And that's in terms of thinking about how the sector can evolve so it's not just higher education and vocational education. How can they actually be joined up? So there's better links between them in terms of degrees, in terms of stepping stones between TAFE and university. So I think that's one point. The other point, a lot of my research and my passion is in equity. And I think in terms of the way equity has been framed in higher education policy, it's often just based on the premise of getting people to university. We don't do a good job or good enough job of actually supporting those students when they're at university.
I wanted to talk about this before, but I forgot in the rush of my presentation. If you want to really do something for equity and create lifetime opportunities for young people, you have to bring the investment in earlier. Teenager years is too late. You've got to put the money here. So I want to show you in early childhood education, it's this teal blur. Australia is still very, very far behind. So remember, this was percentage of GDP of what we spend. That chunk is so big because we still pay out of pocket. So when my son was small and I was a full-time working mom, I took full advantage. It's more expensive to send him to early childcare for 5 days a week than to send him off to Harvard, paying out of pocket. And so when you look at Norway, for instance, where, I don't know, 2.5%, 3% are being spent, 2% are spent of GDP on early, high-quality early childhood education. The French do this really well as well, where they get trained literacy, self-regulation, good nutrition, etc. So if you want to create equal opportunities across the socioeconomic spectrum, you got to invest before the age of 5.
Do we have any questions from the
Your
floor?
turn. I'll come over to you. I've got lots of questions myself. The interesting thing about early childhood education, Stefanie, is that in the response to the terrible situation that occurred in Victoria, the government, their response will largely be more regulation. It won't be in terms of improving quality of it won't be it'll be in terms, the government's response will be in terms of regulation. It won't be in terms of improving the qualifications of staff. It won't be in terms of improving the staff and the ratios, the number of staff in a centre. It won't be in any of those things. It'll just be about regulations. And one of the major companies has just said their response is just put CCTV in. I mean, really, are we... I'm just coming over to this lady here, and on my way I wanted to ask you a question about university rankings. You can rank a university any way you like, depending on the criteria that you want to rank. The universities in Germany don't appear on that list, and a lot of the ones in Scandinavia don't either. Yet they're countries that are doing enormously innovative and entrepreneurial things. What are we wrong in chasing that ranking?
So University of Munich is in the top 20, by the way.
Oh,
they
well
have
done.
a couple of Nobel laureates, but they don't pay them extra. They don't have these loadings. And the dean of the faculty said, we can't attract these highly paid economists from the US because we have Nobel laureates in physics and we just pay them the regular salary. So universities in Australia have to play the game of the ranking really well. And you know, whenever there is a target, everyone tries to reach it who benefits the most from attracting students. And these rankings are being used for students to pick the universities. And if you pay $50,000 per year for your university degree, you pick a university that ranks well in employability. I mean, it's a game. Like the whole, I mean, you might criticize that, and I think for good reasons, but Australian universities played very well. Yeah.
I take your point, and Mike, this is not my question, I take your point about HECS, but I do find it really offensive that the government gets more money from HECS than it gets from coal and gas, and I find that incredibly offensive. So my question is, what is the impact of the casualisation of university staff on the quality of education, and how can we rectify that? And my observation also, and I'm an ex-academic, is that wages in Australia are far less, workloads are far higher than they are in Canada and and in America and other countries?
Do you want to go for that?
Yeah, great question.
I don't have an answer, but I will attempt an answer.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't something I have done research on personally, so it would only be anecdotal from my own experience. But I think in terms of casualisation, that is a concern across the sector. Whether or not it impacts, that's a direct, has direct flow-on effects for teaching quality. I know great people who are employed as sessionals who are fantastic teachers and score really highly on their teaching evaluations. Same as, you know, permanent and fixed-term staff. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was. In terms of the casualisation, I guess the thing is that the student evaluations now mean very, very
Yes.
little because
Yep,
they're a
completely
popularity
agree.
contest, and people are going from casual to full time if they play the game.
That's right, that's
Yeah.
right. I completely agree in terms of the limitations of student evaluation. Unfortunately, they are still valued in the sector and in institutions, particularly if you do want to seek promotion. The thing that worries me a lot is now people who are in those casual sessional roles have really high teaching loads, and they won't be able to probably progress in their career because the thing that still is valued most is research. And people now being really slugged with high teaching loads in terms of their then ability to progress, I think it quite limits that.
I think this is a variation on that theme, and it's possibly an impossible question to answer, but I've listened to some of the language tonight. We've talked about corporatisation and the making business of education. We've talked about equity as if it's confused with ubiquity. And we haven't talked much about academia itself and the importance of academia as the soul of education. And I'm a bit interested in what you might see as a way to regain a little of the lost soul of academia at university level. I know that's an impossible question.
I love that you asked it because I did come from an education system where academia was understood as such. You have examples of professors who saw it really like the Greek academy, walking with their students and walking through the park and the woods and discussing big theories. You can't do this in a mass education system when a university has 70,000 students. In some, I have taught introductory microeconomics, 1,000 students. You can't go for a stroll and think big. You can do this in the honors stream. So I'm teaching in the pre-honors program. I was the honors coordinator. When you have 40 students in a cohort, you can do this. To think big, blue sky research. But I must say, the corporatization has made this impossible. It is mass education. But it's not only the corporatization, it's also the university expansion. And Sally, thank you that you pointed this out with the Bradley Review. This is an international movement, the expansion. Tony Blair brought this in the UK into the discourses later. And he wanted to have 1 in 2 of young people of every birth cohort to go to university. This is crazy. It is absolutely crazy. And the University Accord just signed wants to bring it to higher levels. And why? Because in Australia, they're concerned about the funding model. And I understand it. You just create more demand for the services or the degrees that we are selling. And there is, as such, this is not negative to offer these services. But you can't do mass education easily by still having the soul of creating, I think I had a slide on that. What was it? This promotion of general powers of the mind. It's highly labor intensive. You need to have almost one-on-one training with people to do that. Can't do the mass education.
I'll just add one point. As part of a different project, we've also conducted some interviews with academics, and there's been this sense of an acceleration of time in terms of needing to be more efficient, needing to do more, that you don't really have any time. And I think the the things that have been lost in that acceleration of time is that soul, or what the core activities or the core essence of higher education should be.
I want to give you one little perspective from a system that doesn't do this. So when I was trained in Germany as an undergraduate, because it is you have a constitutional right to a place in university. So you have individuals at university who should not be there, but it's only 24%, I think, in Germany of a cohort that goes to uni, because we have these alternative streams. But the university system, thinking of the ivory tower idea, and you never see your professor, is actually all just an excuse, because they don't have time. German professors teach so much because we don't have these tuition fees. And that means they teach 8 hours per week for 32 weeks a year. In Australia, this is a regular teaching load is 2 to 3 units. So that's maybe 6 hours over 13 weeks, depends. Some have more, some have less, much more time actually. And so there is a lot, I've never seen my professors in Germany, because you don't have a right to the time of your professor, because you don't pay for anything. So it's on the other extreme. So something in between would be good, but I can tell you, the universities in Australia, maybe not everywhere, but many, create wonderful student experiences and also wonderful learning experiences in strong faculties. And that brings me back to the casualization. It's such an important topic because there is wage theft and extraction of scarce resources from workers. I have worked for a couple of months at RMIT University, and I'm not saying in which department, which college. And I've never seen so much slavery in a department, and especially the women. They were all told, you're not good enough, you're not publishing enough, you can never go up for promotions. And the men all went through. And I just couldn't believe it. And on casual contracts, always is slavery. But then there are places where a proper tenure track system is in place. For instance, in my faculty, many schools have that, including the School of Economics, where there are expectations when you're being hired, and the casualization is almost coming to a halt, thanks to the unions. And so there are very good places, and there are really horror freak shows of how industrial relations is being organized and how wage.
Question here. A bit of a change of pace, perhaps, but I'd like your thoughts on a thought experiment. That's a bad term, isn't it? A thought experiment. If you separated out the teaching service of a university with the product in terms of a graduate's or someone's skills and abilities, and if that was entirely independently assessed, which is developing for some people coming from overseas, that they have an independent assessment in Australia about exactly what their knowledge, skills and abilities are, because the credibility of their overseas qualifications is so low. But if the same was applied to Australian universities, where essentially there was, say, some national assessment of whatever, particularly for the more vocational things like particularly health disciplines and science-based disciplines, how would that change universities?
In the interest of time, I'm going to give you both about a minute each, just so we can wrap up the State of Origin.
Because we have so many different assessments, not like 4 times. Through the adolescence NAPLAN, and then we have the 8-hour HSCs, and it's a standardized test. And of course there's school differences of who performs high. I actually can't answer the question because there's a lot of standardized testing in Australia.
Yeah, it is an interesting question in terms of it being a thought experiment. To me, you can't really separate the process of learning to the product. So in terms of thinking about that, the product would be separated out of universities or higher education, I don't see how that would work.
Look, thank you. They're all quick last question.
I'm curious in terms of a degree versus cherry picking subjects in light of the younger generation, not me, but the younger generation having so many job changes over their life cycle. Do you see the role of university changing? And it certainly is in some aspects. I'm not sure in Australia, but certainly overseas, where it's no longer the degree, but it's, you can enrol in a particular subject or a particular set of skills, and they may include some soft skills or problem-solving type things. How do you see that evolving in Australia? It certainly is to a small degree, but in the future, say in the next 5 to 10 years.
I do know it already occurs at some universities, such as University of Melbourne, where you can get more of a generic undergrad degree and then you specialise in your masters. I think that's a model they have taken to provide a bit more of a, it's like a kind of a status kind of flagging exercise in terms of that positioning, but I do see it as something but probably occurring a lot more in higher education, and the shift away from the outcome of a degree to, as Stefanie was saying, in terms of those more soft skills, things like critical thinking, communication. I think that those skills will be emphasised a lot more in years to come.
So we do that too. It's not quite the Melbourne model, but where students have to collect an industry experience, and they have to take units from within the faculty. We are located in a Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, which brings great benefits for an economics degree. Because the students can take sociology, philosophy, languages, etc., have more choice and cherry pick, as you say. But that's very specific to where schools are being located and how much this idea feeds into that. And I could even see this further, that you under the graduate degree is not just cherry picking across, but also maybe I could see adding just a year education. Why does it have to be 3 years or 5 years? And that exists in the US to some degree with 2-year colleges, and I see definitely a market for that.
I guess that's what I was saying, not so much the whole degree, but you might just need some skills in a certain space.
Yeah. Thank you so much. One thing is really clear, and that is that it's time in Australia for a serious national conversation about education. And we've been privileged to be part of that conversation and tonight. So would you please join me in thank Professor Stefanie Schurer and Dr. Sally Patfield and Chloe Lindstrom. Thank you so much. Next month is such an exciting month. I know you're laughing at this. The CEO of the National High Speed Rail Network is coming here to tell us what's going on. Now, Tim Parker is the CEO, and he has delivered North Connects, the Hong Kong airport, and other major infrastructure around the world. Now, he's coming here to tell us exactly what the Commonwealth Government is doing in relation to a high-speed train and the whole high-speed rail network. It's your chance to ask him, is it on track? Is it off the rails? Is it stopped at the station? So next month in August, please come along and bring your friends, the National High Speed Rail Network. CEO will be here. So thank you, right here in this location, right here tonight. Second Wednesday next month. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.